So my deconstruction of my faith happened over a long period of time, and I really tried to examine nearly every aspect of the Christian faith that I could, because that's what I believed in at the time was Christianity. I really wanted to dive deep into biblical history and like the theology of Christianity, what were its flaws, where was it weak? And so I really wanted to dive into that. And one of the topics that's routinely discussed is the finding of the empty tomb, because every single gospel has a different way for women to find the tomb empty. There are different reasons in each gospel for why the women are going to the tomb, how they find the tomb, what's in the tomb when they get there, and all of that. And that has always been a pretty big red flag to me as far as considering the gospels to be eyewitness accounts. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is just one particular aspect of it, and that's why the women didn't run away in Mark and tell the disciples afterwards. Today we have Theological, who is exploring reality here on YouTube. I'll have the original video linked down in the description if you want to go and check it out, because I think that he has a pretty well-made video here, and he has a lot of great, pretty decent videos as far as from a Christian apologetic standpoint goes. So I definitely suggest checking him out, but I have a lot of issues with this video. And today we're just going to start with the women running away and not saying anything to anyone, because that seems to be a pretty big contradiction with the other gospels and how they portray events after the tomb is found empty. So if you want to fuck around and find out why the empty tomb is definitely not a historical fact, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Like I said, we're taking a look at a video by Theological, who is exploring reality here on YouTube. He is going to be explaining why there is no contradiction at the end of Mark when the women run away scared and don't tell anybody anything, and the other gospels record post-resurrection appearances. All right, so let's get to Than and his explanation for this apparent contradiction.
Throughout Mark's gospel, there's a strong emphasis on the reversal of expectations, echoing the teachings of Jesus that the first will be the last, the low will be exalted, and the high will be made low. And so, that same motif extends now to Mark 16, where women are the first witnesses to Jesus' empty tomb.
Yes, this is a theme that's present in all of the Gospels. It's set forth by probably Paul, talking about, how, the least shall be first, or at least portraying Jesus as really speaking to the poorer class of individuals that are in the area and everything. So, I mean, it definitely is something that's baked in early into Christianity. And so it's very reasonable that it appears in the Gospels as one of the main themes. And there's a lot of narrative elements in the Gospels that are driven by this whole least shall be first thing, or the first shall be last and the last shall be first, as Mark puts it. The narrative portion of this is very strong in all the Gospels, especially in Mark, and that is a main driver for a lot of the story elements in all of the Gospels. This is acknowledged by a majority of New Testament scholars, even some non-critical scholars. But for the most part, the critical scholars that are not driven by a Christian bias, they agree with this theme being a major driver for a lot of the story elements.
It goes against the grain of what you'd expect, just like the rest of the gospel. Instead of the privileged male disciples, it's the marginalized women who discover the empty tomb and go and proclaim the resurrected Christ, just like it was the Gentiles to first recognize Jesus' divinity. As Richard Carrier states, given Mark's narrative agenda, regardless of the actual facts, having women first at the tomb is exactly what Mark would invent to carry through the gospel message, the least shall be first.
Well, yeah, and I agree with Dr. Carrier here on this point, because I feel like if you had like the disciples finding the empty tomb, or having some other privileged person in the life of Jesus find the tomb first, I feel like that definitely goes against the grain of the entire theme that everybody was building up until this point, and all of the messages that Christianity was pushing. Christianity was trying to push a certain narrative And so this finding of the empty tomb by the women advances that narrative. So yeah, I totally agree with this. I feel like this is an accurate take. Now, obviously I'm not expert or anything like that. Dr. Carrier would be an expert, but Dr. Carrier, amongst a litany of other scholars, all agree about this narrative need for the women to find the tomb empty. Like, that's just how that story makes sense.
Now, this is a really interesting objection, but I think it's got a lot of issues with it. First, I want you to take a step back and kind of just consider from a bird's eye view the dialectical landscape of the empty tomb narratives, specifically Mark 16. Typically, skeptics here want to point out an alleged contradiction. In the other Gospels, women discover the empty tomb of Jesus and return to tell the others. Mark tells us, on the other hand, that the women kept it quiet, at least as far as the original ending goes.
Yes. And we know that this bothered later Christians, the fact that Mark doesn't record the women telling the disciples about this, or there really being post-resurrection appearances, because we have things like in 1 Corinthians 15 with the Pauline Creed, he says that Jesus appeared to them. So it's kind of strange that the first gospel that's written doesn't actually contain any of these post-resurrection appearances that even Paul states happened. So because it's an embarrassing thing that was left out, Christians went back and added a post-resurrection appearance. And we know that it was added because we find the ending of Mark in different states, with the earliest state of the ending stopping at Mark 16:8, because the earliest manuscripts that we have this shorter ending that ends at Mark 16:8. So how appropriate historical research would go is that the closer a manuscript is to when it was being written or when it was first written is more likely a more accurate version of the original that we no longer have. And considering our earliest manuscripts do not contain any of the verses after Mark 16:8, it seems like this shorter ending is the original ending that was there. Now, we don't know for 100% certain, but we haven't found any evidence to suggest the longer ending, whether that's the actual longer ending or even a longer ending. There's two different endings that appear in various manuscripts. We don't know if those were the original and that this was a rewrite, but we don't have any evidence that any of those precedes this shorter ending. So it seems like it definitely stops there, which was a problem for Christians after this point, because they went in and they added things later so that it coincides with the other gospels, so that it coincides with what Paul was saying. This was an embarrassing fact that they changed, showing that they could actually change what the gospel said, and therefore we don't know what they originally said because we have no original manuscripts of them. The first indication that we have of exactly how often the Bible was changed doesn't occur until the 4th century and the 300s. Before that time, we just have a lead wall up. We can't see past it. We don't know how much these gospels were edited prior to this point, but we do know that they were edited, and so we can use textual criticism in order to find certain interpolated passages, like, for instance, with the Gospel of John and the stoning of Mary Magdalene. That was added much later by a Christian who was looking to push a certain narrative. And there are other elements throughout the other gospels that were definitely added later. So we know that if there is in fact an embarrassing aspect to the gospels and the Christians considered it embarrassing, they most likely would have changed it. They had enough motive to change it. But I feel like what we're going to find in this video, probably in the second response to this video, because we're not going to get through all of it today, but what we're going to find is some speculation as to what is actually embarrassing to Christians, which that's normally how it goes. I don't know which way Than is going to go with this, but typically when they start talking about criterion of embarrassment, they automatically assume what is embarrassing to people, specifically Christians in the 1st century. So I feel like there's going to be a lot of speculation surrounding this.
Now, for this video, I'm not going to show why this contradiction isn't an actual contradiction or talk about the long ending of Mark and what the original said or any of that. For now, I just want to show an inconsistency and a dilemma that this raises for the skeptic that wants to use this theological/narrative motif approach to the empty tomb narratives as an objection. Well, here's the dilemma. In the first horn, if the women fail to convey the message of the resurrection and instead remain silent due to fear, according to Mark 16:8, it casts them in a negative light. Instead of being shown in a positive light, fearlessly proclaiming the resurrected Jesus, they cower in fear and say nothing. which appears contrary to this idea of the meek and the humble being exalted and the exalted being made low.
I don't agree that this casts them in a negative light. In fact, I would think that taking the original ending with Mark and combining it with what we know that Paul wrote about what happened after Jesus resurrected, mainly that he appeared to Peter, the mysterious 12, James, John, and then the 500, which could be an interpolation, and the other people, including Paul himself. We know that there was a claim that Jesus appeared to people. Now, if we combine that with what Mark says, being that the women were driven away and they were scared and didn't tell anybody anything, I feel like that only enhances the effect of Jesus or God's power and ability. Because you have to understand, if we look at Paul in Galatians 1, he specifically says that he did not get his information from anybody here on earth. And this is very important for the first Christians, because the first Christians couldn't claim to have gotten this historically. They couldn't have claimed to have known that Jesus did resurrect because it happened as a matter of history. That was not important at all. What was important was getting direct revelation from Jesus. So my guess is, this is my hypothesis, is that the Gospel of Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, was thinking, well, I can't have these women run away and immediately tell people that Jesus was resurrected, because it's important to not get this information from any person on earth. It has to come directly from Jesus. And with this in mind, and knowing that Paul and Peter and James and all them were proclaiming that they got revelation from Jesus and not being told by women, it seems like it would only enhance it. God takes these situations where humans either fail or they're weak and they fail God, and then God uses them in order to exalt himself, right? He uses the situation to exalt himself. So the fact that the women don't say anything only adds a more rich story when you combine it with what Paul was saying. And we definitely know that Mark had access to Paul's letters. So him knowing that Jesus was the one that presented himself to everybody instead of women telling him, Mark couldn't have the women telling them. And so it actually doesn't make a lot of sense, considering how Mark's gospel, as far as we understand it, was developed. It doesn't make sense to have the women run back and tell the disciples. But that's probably why in the longer ending to Mark, not only do you have the women telling the disciples, but then Jesus appears and gives them the Great Commission or whatever. They figure out ways in order to still make it Jesus revealed himself, and that's the only way that they really know that all of this stuff. Because even that's in the very ending of the Mark's gospel, because it wasn't Jesus that necessarily revealed himself, because there's no post-resurrection appearances, but there is some kind of divine celestial figure that reveals that Jesus is doing that. So the information's still coming from a source of God. My entire point is that this first horn that he has doesn't actually make sense with how the Gospel of Mark is constructed and the sources that we know were used in order to craft Mark's gospel.
So here's the point on this first horn. If the skeptic wants to insist there's a contradiction here, well, this actually goes against this other argument they want to make as an objection to the empty tomb narrative.
I don't understand how this could contradict any other kind of argument. I feel like this is totally what would be expected upon somebody like a first century Jewish Christian writing a gospel about a Christ and wanting to present it as, oh, the tomb was found empty. Who's going to find the tomb empty? Well, that's going to be women. Women were the last people to see Jesus on the cross and die, and they were the last ones to see where Jesus was buried. So they're going to be the first ones to find that Jesus is resurrected. That totally plays into Mark's story here, just as it's constructed. Like, it makes no sense to have anybody else like find the tomb. I don't see how there's anything contradictory or anything like that, but maybe this second horn will explain it.
Here's the other horn. If the more plausible interpretation of Mark 16:8 holds true, and the silence of the women is only meant to be temporary on their way back to Galilee, then this is still not casting the women in a reversal role the skeptic wants to insist. The reason why is because the women sure are the first ones to discover the empty tomb, but they're not the ones going out to proclaim the resurrected Jesus still.
I don't see how this is a problem for the whole aspect of, well, this is a narrative-driven event and it's not representative of history. Because you notice the ad hoc speculation here that the women were only silent on their way back to Galilee and then they told the disciples. This is totally against the grain of what Paul was talking about and what Christians at the point in which Mark was writing would have understood about the revelation of Jesus as a resurrected Savior. Under the understanding of anybody that was following Paul, which apparently the Gospel of Mark was definitely following Paul in some kind of sense. He at least had access to Paul's letters and believed a lot of the things that Paul also believed. Why would a person like that write about women revealing that Jesus was resurrected instead of having Jesus reveal himself, as Paul denotes in 1 Corinthians 15? It makes no sense to say, oh, they were only silent on the way back and then they told everybody. Like, this is something that you're tacking onto it and you're inserting into the narrative, and it doesn't have any basis in any of the known sources that were used to construct Mark's gospel. So I don't understand why you would want to add more speculation and ad hoc statements to your hypothesis, because that only weakens it. Ad hoc and speculative statements only weaken your hypothesis, and the hypothesis with the least amount of ad hoc speculations is more likely to be the actual reality of the situation. Like, it's going to be the true solution, I guess you could say. It's more likely to be the true solution.
Instead, they're sort of just passing the torch to the disciples. The women go and tell the male disciples, but the male disciples still get the privilege of seeing the resurrected Jesus and going out to proclaim his resurrection.
Right, which means that there's no need to have the women tell the disciples. In fact, having the women tell the disciples and then Jesus revealing himself seems to be degrading the story. Like, it degrades the actual message of Christianity and the message of Paul. I don't see how this is a better explanation when it makes the story worse.
Given 1 Corinthians 15:5, a tradition Mark certainly would have been familiar with, when writing his gospel, Mark obviously anticipates Peter and the other apostles having a Christophany in Galilee, and that the appearance ended up convincing the 12 of Jesus' divinity and resurrection. So this doesn't fit Mark's overall narrative theme quite nicely. In other words, it ends with the disciples recognizing that Jesus is the Messiah, and that therefore Mark is liberated from this narrative motif that the skeptic so badly wants to insert into the text.
Well, for one thing, we can't really say what Mark thought about what actually happened to the women afterwards. Like, he's going back to the whole, oh, well, the women must have told them because, obviously Paul talks about getting revelation of Jesus. But I feel like Mark's understanding that the women didn't have to tell anybody just works with that in the way that, well, Paul isn't reliant on recognizing that any women told anybody. Women telling people thing just seems like an extra bit of information that is not needed for Mark's gospel. Of course, Mark's gospel is different than like Matthew and Luke's. Both of those were written for very specific audiences, and those audiences had post-resurrection appearances in them because it was necessitated by the story. Mark's gospel was written in a way that coincides with what Paul was teaching in 1 Corinthians 15. Obviously, if Mark, I'm only speculating here, which I know degrades a hypothesis, but the best that we can do at this point is really speculate about what Mark was thinking because we don't actually know. I could totally see, I think it's parsimonious to think that Mark was thinking, oh, well, Jesus revealed himself to Peter, Paul, James, John, and all them. Jesus revealed himself. So the women don't have to tell anybody, and I don't have to put in any kind of post-resurrection appearances, is probably what he was thinking here. But as a matter of recording actual history, I would think that you would want to record what happened to the disciples, like as a matter of history. And, that's what Luke and Matthew are trying to do, which I feel like only solidifies this argument that Mark's gospel is just a narrative. The narrative ends where it needs to end. And that is, I guess, what you could say is the beauty of the narrative. You don't have to elaborate and tell people directly, oh, Jesus revealed himself to people, because that's not the purpose of Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel isn't the purpose wasn't to present history. It was to write a narrative about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And you don't actually have to write about Jesus revealing himself to people because people already know that Jesus revealed himself to people. So as far as advancing this argument that the empty tomb is more of a narrative element rather than a historical event, I feel like the fact that this contradiction between the gospel accounts exists only helps enhance the narrative element of Mark.
So if the skeptic insists on there being a contradiction here, this objection won't work, and they have to give it up. If it's conceded that there's no contradiction, then the case to be made about the invented empty tomb motif is still met with data that severely undercuts it. So which is it? Is it concede there's no contradiction, or are we going to say that we're going to hold to this theory that has very little evidence for it and a lot of evidence against it?
But I don't see that there's a lot of evidence against it at all. In fact, I've discussed how the evidence actually coincides with the narrative need for the empty tomb rather than it as a historical fact. It really depends on how we're comparing the Gospels. If we are comparing the Gospels as if they are historical documents that record what happened in history, the fact that Mark has the women running away and not saying anything to anybody is directly contradictory with the other Gospels saying that they ran away and immediately told the disciples. This is totally contradictory in nature. So if we're looking at them, we're comparing them as if they are supposed to be relaying the same information. This is definitely a contradiction that doesn't have a good resolution to it. And it just shows that they were not actually recording the same events, whether that be fabricated or otherwise. They just weren't telling the same story, right? That is a contradiction there. So if we look at the Gospels as literary constructions for certain communities that were existing and that were writing stories about Jesus and everything, I think that the fact that they are contradictory just shows how different the communities were and what the needs of each community were. The later communities, they needed to hear about these post-resurrection appearances. They needed to know what happened after Jesus resurrected and everything. And so the fact that Mark's gospel was written for a community that didn't need that and didn't focus on that because they already had Paul and everybody like that was going around preaching all this stuff, and everybody already knew that Jesus did post-resurrection appearances. By the later time, they needed to record those things. And that's why it was embarrassing for later Christians to read Mark's gospel and have the women running away all scared and everything. So they added a longer ending to Mark because it was an embarrassing fact. So if we look at the gospels from a literary perspective, meaning that all of the story elements and everything like that are driven for a narrative need and theological need rather than historical recording of historical events, I feel like the contradiction doesn't matter all that much. The fact that there is a contradiction between the stories, it doesn't matter to me a whole hell of a lot unless you're talking about these stories as if they're historical fact. Then that becomes a problem. Now, Than does go on in this video to comment on the reason why women are the ones to find the tomb empty, but we are going to be discussing that next time. That's all that I have time for today, but we will be getting to the rest of Than's video in another installment of my response to this video. So if you will, let me know down below with what you thought about Than's response to this contradiction. Do you still find it to be a contradiction? How do you think the nuance plays into Than's understanding, or maybe not just Than's understanding, but a general Christian's understanding of the Gospels? I feel like for the most part, you could definitely say that it is a contradiction because they all consider the Gospels to be recording historical events. If you look at it from a purely narrative, like literary perspective, I don't think the contradiction matters all that much. But that also means that they aren't recording historical events. And so that means that the empty tomb is not historical, at least as recorded by the Gospels. So let me know what your thoughts are down below in the comments. And while you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.